Remember Lost? Most don't because the ending was stupid. Some swore off TV for years, and some turned to watching reality shows. I took away one thing: Smoke Monster. Years went by in a flash, and I'm watching his Dark Materials, and in Season 2, no spoilers here, there are these things called Specters. They're kind of like Dementors in style, and also like moving smoke. I immediately wanted to figure out how to do that effect. I'd read that those shots aged the crew a bit, and this one aged me too. Now, how would I go about doing this? First, I wanted some footage to put this effect into that would give me some idea of what this thing will do. I found this on Pexels, and it'll do pretty well. There's some dude in the back looking at his cell phone and not paying attention, so he's like perfect for this. To put any effect in here, I'd need to camera track this shot. I chose Blender because, well, it's free, and reasons. I had to make a series of PNG files from this so the tracker would work better for me. So I opened up the movie file in the compositing workspace and loaded in the MP4. I attached a viewer to the chain so I could see what I'm doing, and then split the noodle by holding Shift and dragging over it. Now I could hook it into two places and not get my Schwartz twisted. Next, I needed to figure out how many frames I'd need. I chose 6 seconds from the end. The footage was 508 frames long, so I stepped back to 364 to give it 144 frames that makes up 6 seconds of footage at 24 frames per second. And adjusted the timeline to match that. Then I also made sure that the color management was not set to Filmic, but to sRGB, so it's more true to what was shot and not fluffed by Blender. Then I chose PNG 16 and rendered out the sequence of files at 24 frames per second. That seemed like a good idea, so I went with it. The footage was not originally 24 frames per second, so the motion blur might be off, and it's definitely not perfect. But there's like a dude on his cell phone in this, and it's perfect for me, so I didn't care. Not one bit. Now that I had my unperfect PNG sequence, it was time to camera track it. For the uninitiated, that just means figuring out what the camera is doing and recreating the movements in the software so we can get a virtual camera. It's like geek stuff. Just go with it. I went into the VFX tab in Blender and loaded in my PNG sequence. I then hit Set Scene Frames in Prefetch because I've seen other people do it, and if it works for them, it works for me. It basically sets your scene length and loads your frames into RAM so it runs faster. I then hit Detect Features, which adds all these little yellow dots. These are pixels that will be tracked through the timeline. It only gave me a few. I was sad. Oh well. I hit the play forward button to begin tracking. Look at those little effers go. Some turn red on their journey. That's okay. We can select them, then scrub the timeline to figure out where they gave up, then hit the kill forward button to make sure they don't do any damage. From there, we can hit Ctrl L to lock them, and then save their lives. I continued to do this for way too long until I got decent results. I scrubbed both forward and backward, and killed the red ones forward and backward as well, and then locked them off. The more of these you have in your scene, the better it seems. Some will go all the way, but most won't. You can add in more tracking markers too, in places that have contrast. Hit play forward and backward until you get them working, then lock them off when they become useless. Watch your tracks too. Any graph line that goes berserker like Sonny Corleone you should probably get rid of. Then, when I was ready, I hit Solve Camera, and I got an error over 1. Crap. I went back in and added more markers until my solve was under 1. I figured under 1 would be okay for this, as it's going to be like a moving smoke thing, but like under 0.3 would have been best. But yeah, oh well. When I got my track, it looked decent. I hit Set Up Tracking Scene and I added in a cube. I then selected 3 points on the floor and hit Floor. Now I had a cube on the floor. This is cool because it allowed me to see if my scene was slipping. It seemed okay. Not perfect, but livable. In reality, I'd want this perfect, but I also want to get this video out. The camera is all off, so I was lazy here and I manually adjusted it. After scrubbing the timeline, it seemed as if my track was decent. It would probably work. I then turned my tracking markers into nulls that I could see in Blender's layout by hitting 3D markers to mesh. I also hit link empty, but that gave me suck, and I hate that, so I deleted all those empties. There, now I had a scene that I could work with. Aside from being turned 45 degrees, but I could live with that, as I'm not handing this off to anyone else to work with. I didn't want to mess up anything else either, so I just wanted to move along. Now the effect. I made a lattice in Blender, and I decided to push geometry through it to get the initial animation going. With the PNG sequence and the scene backdrop, I could look through my camera and get the animation I want. I modeled a flat plane for now, with a subdivision surface modifier attached, and keyframed it at the beginning and the end of the timeline. Looking at the tracking markers, I could get a decent idea of where that phone dude was sitting, and where the start was. This allowed me to adjust things on the fly. I added a lattice modifier to the flat plane thing, and then went in and adjusted the points on the lattice in edit mode. That made the thing bend and curve and stuff. Perfect. Once I had what I thought I wanted, I exported this piece as an Alembic file. It'll bake out the animation and subdivisions, but I applied the subdivision surface first so my computer didn't have to do more work on export. This is the part that aged me. I decided to bring this Alembic into Houdini to apply particles or cloth or whatever made this thing look wispy and cool like the Specters in that show. I'd read that they'd used Houdini for it anyway, so why not? I have nothing to lose but time and brain cells. Looking at the way they moved, I'd known I need cloth and particles. This could work in Blender, but Houdini is made for this stuff and it crashes less for me. The first thing in Houdini was to lay down a geonode, dive in, and throw down an Alembic node. Then I loaded in the Alembic file, and yay, there it is. After telling it to unpack and not to use polysoup primitives, I had access to the geometry. I knew I needed cloth. I did a version of particles and it looked like this. It's like something like the guys from Jersey Shore would put in their hair. Not cool. So cloth it is. I threw down a vellum cloth, then constraints, then a solver. The first establishes the cloth, the second will allow us to use Alembic animation, and the solver makes it all work from frame to frame. When I'd hit play, I saw what I thought I'd see. It just falls. No animation that we did in Blender. That's where the middle comes in. I'd selected that, then went in and chose pin to target for the constraint type, pin type and orientation to soft, and match animation. When I hit play now, there she goes. Of course, I wasn't getting any cloth sim look though. I had to get crafty. I went into the vellum solver and I added a pop wind force into the out node. After playing around with the settings for like 3 hours, I had something moving. I'm just kidding. All I did was turn the stiffness way down and I saw the effect. Cool. I knew then that I had something I could refine, so I went to work refining it. This is the part that took hours. Getting the look of controllable smoke or ethereal crap isn't really intuitive, you know? You think like it's so easy, like I'd been using 3D for a month and even I can make Specters. Like no, it doesn't work like that. It's iterative. After studying frames from the show, I'd realized I needed some twisting and curling. The wind alone wouldn't do it, nor would the swirl factor. I needed more. Something way more. Something custom. I created a volume to surround the whole animation and set the resolution to like 150. Into this volume, I'd create a custom force field that will curl. To do that, I added in a volume VOP node. Inside this node, I deleted the output because I wasn't going to use it, and added in a curl noise node. I attached P to position, and then added a bind export to export this value from inside the VOP network back into my scene. This is tricky, but the more you do it, the more sense it makes. Houdini is all about data flowing. I also make sure the curl noise type is set to vector and the name is velocity. Remember, data. It gives me a cloud. How nice. Pretty, innit? I had to resize the volume to cover the animation so that the force field would affect the cloth throughout the whole timeline. Now the trick to getting that little noise network to work was to call it into the vellum solver. I did this with a pop advect by volumes node. All those words mean is move my points around in time inside the box I made. That's it. That's it. I plugged that into the output, then called in the volume VOP node into the SOP field, and yeah, that's it. It's just telling this node where to get information from. That's literally all I'm doing. It's like nothing magical. I turned the velocity scale up and then added the name velocity in there. Hit play and yeah, it's curling. The noise is working. I love it when a plan comes together. It's a bit weird, so I added a pop drag after the other one to slow down the effect. That's all that's really happening here. You want another filter, add another node. Now, I aged a bit here playing with the stiffness settings on both the vellum constraints and the drag and velocity forces of the curl noise and all the other settings until I was sort of happy. I'm never really happy in Houdini because it's like endless, but you know, you gotta move on. The stiffness seems to work well at about 10,000 on the first constraint and nothing on the pin to target one below. I also increased the volume density on the volume node to tighten up the curl field distance and to give smaller swirls to the cloth. It's a game, but man, under a deadline it'll age you. The thing works, but it's too thin. Luckily, I could go in and add a copy node after the subdivide one and get more thickness. Now I went back down and turned on the display for the vellum salt, the green node, and yeah, better. Wow, not bad. Once I got the motion decent, I realized I'd wanted more swirl and more wispiness, but wouldn't get that with just the simple shape. Here's where I went back into Blender and I made it happen. I could have done that in Houdini or brought the whole scene into Houdini with the background, but this was working for me, so I just ran with it. Cool. Once I was happy with the motion and watching it in a trance for a while, I wanted to make it fluid. Sure, the motion of the cloth makes it nice and organic, but I don't want this to be the cloth. Houdini let me turn this into points. So I did a scatter shop after the vellum solver. Now the points will move like cloth. I made a whole lot of points. This is where Blender would usually crash for me. Now, to make it look like fluid, I added a particle fluid surface node. That makes it like gooey and fluidy by drawing a mesh from the particles. Blender is getting this feature now, but it still has a way to go. I aged more here playing with the numbers. This file will be up on my Patreon account in the Houdini tier for those who want it. After playing, I got something cool, so I added an Alembic ROP output to the end of the chain and saved out the Alembic file to bring back into Blender. Once back in Blender, I loaded it in, played it, and not bad, but I wanted more. I went back and forth, testing and iterating. It was time to integrate this into the shot. There were other ways to do this now, and this way is a bit dated, but whatever. I just wanted this effect, not an Academy Award for Best Technical Achievement. I modeled out some awnings and gave the ground a bit more character. I could have gone crazy here with the bumps and stuff, but the shadow from this will be diffused anyway, so I saw how much I could get away with. I added an area light, then set the ground to be a shadow catcher in the object panel, and yeah, a shadow. Getting there. I added some geometry to the places where the shadow would distort and sculpted out a wall in the places where the products come out. I wasn't going for perfection here, but something to catch some shadow and sell it a bit more. Test it out and yeah, not too bad. After playing around a few more times, getting the shape and sim in Houdini where I wanted it, I brought the Alembic back into Blender and gave it a volume shader. I put a color ramp in Absorption 2 to emulate the wall and the floor color bounce. Once I had what I wanted, I set it to render with OpenEXR multi-layer and Z-depth turned on. Cycles doesn't seem to render out vector data on volumes, so I rendered it with motion blur on. Otherwise, I would usually apply motion blur in post. This is a drawback to Cycles at the moment, unless I'm wrong on that. Once I had that render, I went back and just rendered a pass for the shadows, then brought it all into DaVinci Resolve. Once in DaVinci with my footage loaded, I dropped the background into my timeline, then right-clicked and opened it in Fusion. Here, I merged the shadow pass over the backplate and set it to multiply. Once you do this, you need to set the correct layers to display for the EXR files. They're all in this list here. The shadow is a bit grainy, so I blurred it out a bit with a blur node. It's a volume, so I'm not too concerned with the shadow being like crazy accurate or even too dark. Having some ground displacement here would help, but oh well. Next, I brought in the Spectre and yeah, way too dark. I added a gamut here and set the out to wide gamut RGB. I also turned on a pre-post divide multiply thing to blend out those edges. I added a color correct node here and played around a bit just in an attempt to match it up more. I also need a depth of field blur, so I added in a depth blur node, then piped in the Z-depth pass from another in by selecting Z-depth and plugging it in. Then once I had that, I adjusted it to match as best I could and went to color correct. After playing around a bit and getting rid of the clipped areas, I called it in, and here it is. Not bad for a Spectre's Smoke Monster first run. It needs much more love, but it's getting there. I need to move on to other videos though. This one was just took a while. So here it is. It works and it's up on Patreon. The whole thing with Houdini is up on that tier if you're interested. I hope this helps some of you out there, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks.